Welcome back, everybody. This is part 3 of our Chapter 5 lecture series, this section entitled The Coming of Independence. The focus question for this section is, what key events marked the move toward American independence? In direct response to the intolerable or coercive acts of 1774, the colony of Massachusetts issued what were known as the Suffolk Resolves. This document basically urged Americans to refuse to obey the new laws, withhold taxes, and prepare for war. And in October of 1774, at the urging of the Massachusetts colonies, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies, all except for Georgia, met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. The Continental Congress endorsed the Suffolk Resolves and formed the Continental Association, the precursor to what would become the United States. The aim of this Continental Association was to halt all trade with Britain. Again, the hope was to hurt Britain where Britain felt it the most, in their wallets, to get them to back down from continued passage and enforcement of taxes and new restrictive laws. As a result of the First Continental Congress calls to ban all trade with Britain, across the colonies, committees of safety were formed to enforce those boycotts. These committees essentially operated as a shadow government, and this was a beginning of a process that transferred effective political power from colonial governments, whose authority derived from Great Britain, to extra-legal bodies reflecting the popular will. These committees of safety were essentially designed to replace those colonial and royal governments in the colonies. Also, as a part of these committees of safety, began the recruitment of what were known as Minutemen, which were essentially civilian militiamen who were trained to respond on short notice to any real or perceived threats from the British government or British troops stationed in the region. By 1775, as a result of all of this resistance against British authority, talk of liberty spread like wildfire throughout the colonies. There began to be more concrete ideas about the rights to resist authority. There was increasing identification of liberty with the cause of God. And colonists based these claims of liberty on their perceptions of the historical rights of Englishmen, natural rights as elucidated by Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, and universal freedom. In April of 1775, the war officially began with the battles of Lexington and Concord. Essentially, the British had heard rumors that there were stockpiles of weapons in these two Massachusetts towns, so they sent out some troops to go investigate and confiscate any such weapons that they found. These British troops were met by small forces of colonial militia to resist the confiscation of these weapons. A standoff ensued, and it's still not sure exactly who fired first, but shots were fired, and several colonists were actually killed in these first altercations between the British and the colonists. The initial shot became famously referred to as the shot heard round the world, as this signaled the first time a colony had tried to overthrow or resist imperial authority with military action. The aftermath of the battles of Lexington and Concord saw the British retreat in haste back along the road to Boston, where they were harried and harassed the entire time by colonial Minutemen and militia hiding behind trees and bushes and taking pot shots at them as they escaped back along the road. In May of 1775, Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys captured Fort Ticonderoga, which was one of the more significant British forts in the region, and colonial forces quickly surrounded the British in Boston, placing Boston under a semi-siege-like status. This led to the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was the British attempt to drive off those colonial militias that had surrounded the town of Boston. Now, the colonists technically lost this battle, but they proved that they could stand toe-to-toe on their own terms against the British Army. This was not an easy win for the British, and quite a few British troops lost their lives in the altercation. This greatly increased the morale of the independence-minded colonists and the drive towards revolution. Shortly after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Second Continental Congress authorized the raising of a Continental Army. Confidence in independence among the American colonists was certainly not a unanimous sentiment. The range of opinion really reflected that 20-60-20 rule, where you had 20% firmly committed to the ideas of revolution and independence, 20% firmly convicted that the American colonies should remain within the British Empire, and 60% who really could have gone either which way. There were many who had fear of a complete break with Britain and exactly what that would mean in economic, political, and social terms. A lot of the elites had fear of anarchy from below, that the poor and the middling sorts were getting too much power and having too much say in what was going on with the independence movement. And of course, you had a large faction of loyalists who did remain loyal to Britain at the beginning of the war and throughout the course of the war. There was also fear of Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Shortly after the outbreak of hostilities, the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, offered freedom to slaves who enlisted in the Royal Army. Now, this did have the effect of encouraging many slaves in the southern regions to escape their enslavement and seek out the British lines to take advantage of this offer. And this proclamation by Lord Dunmore really helped to galvanize greater support of the independence movement in the South as slave owners became fearful of losing their slaves and any sort of revolt or rebellion that might be incurred because of the proclamation. Now, the colonial leaders represented in the Continental Congress were also reticent to move forward with full independence. And in July of 1775, they issued what has been termed the Olive Branch Petition, where they wrote a letter directly to King George asking him to intervene between the colonies and Parliament and settle the conflict. King George refused this offer, and this really hammered home to many of the colonists, particularly the leaders in Continental Congress, that revolution and independence was really the only way forward. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine issued his famous pamphlet known as Common Sense. This pamphlet was an attack on the principles of hereditary rule and monarchical government. It called for a democratic system based on frequent elections and, key, a written constitution. He basically stated that the cause of America and the democratic and republican principles enshrined within that cause is in great measure the cause of all mankind. Now, few of Paine's ideas were original. They were all developed from the core of Enlightenment thought that we have previously discussed. But his use of language and the distribution of this pamphlet were aimed at everyday people rather than just the educated elite. And this pamphlet really played a large role in educating the general populace on exactly what the revolution and independence meant for them and for the colonies as a whole. It was one of the most successful and influential pamphlets in the history of political writing. After the failure of the Olive Branch Petition in 1775, the colonies decided to move forward with full independence. This led to the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson and approved by the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776. It basically began with a list of grievances directed against King George III for his failure to act against Parliament in favor of the colonies. Now, the preamble, which had the statements that all men are created equal and had certain unalienable rights, had an enduring impact that still resonates in American history today. It can't be overstated how revolutionary those statements were and how they would influence not only the American Revolution, but revolutions around the world and the ideas of natural rights that accompanied these concepts. The Declaration was ultimately an assertion of the right of the colonies to revolt. Now, the Declaration pretty much completed that shift to natural rights as the object of American independence. And of course, it drew heavily on the writings of John Locke. John Locke's ideas of the protection of life, liberty, and property were translated in the Declaration of Independence to the protection of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A small but important distinction, but still fundamentally the same sort of declaration. The Declaration enshrined for all time the ideas of individual self-fulfillment, that pursuit of happiness part, and self-determination, the right of the people to determine how they would be governed. It cannot be overstated how significant the American Revolution was, not just in America, but across the globe. Even though these Enlightenment principles that underscored the ideas and concepts that proliferated around the Revolution, prior to the American Revolution, they were just that, ideas and concepts. The American Revolution was the first time that these concepts had been put into practice. The American Revolution created a distinctive definition of national identity resting on freedom. From the beginning, the notion of American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States has a special mission as a refuge from tyranny, a symbol of freedom, and a model for the rest of the world, has been central to American nationality and nationalism. Guys like Thomas Paine and others believe that the American Revolution was an event of global historical importance with the power to reshape the world. Without the burden of monarchy, aristocracy, and hereditary privilege of the old world of Europe, America would be a new nation governed by Enlightenment principles of universal freedom. For over 2 centuries, the Declaration has inspired generations of Americans denied the enjoyment of their natural rights and colonial people all over the world seeking independence. It quickly appeared in French and German, and it was considered so dangerous by the Spanish government that it tried to prevent its translation into Spanish. Numerous anti-colonial movements, the first of which occurred in Flanders, which is in the Netherlands, where a break with the Austrian Empire brewed, have modeled their efforts on the Declaration of Independence. More than half of today's independent countries have similar declarations. In a global context, the Declaration has become an assertion of the right to form independent states rather than a listing of citizens' rights not to be governmentally abridged. Furthermore, the notion of the will of the people has been adopted all over the world. Even before the end of the Revolution, European colonists and other empires demanded increased local autonomy, often based on American arguments. To the dismay of those who ruled over them, groups all over the world for the first time could speak the language of rights for the people. That concludes part 3 of our Chapter 5 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.